You are listening to the Complete Developer Podcast, the podcast by coders, for coders, about all aspects of creating your best life as a developer.
I'm Will, the accomplished developer and aspiring software architect.
And I'm Beej, the advancing journeyman developer.
Complete Developer Podcast is supported by listeners like you. We are now on Patreon at www.patreon.com/Complete Developer Podcast.
Tale as old as time, song as old as rhyme, CSS and HTML. We've invited Aimee Knight on to help us beautify our stories with CSS. She's a software engineer, podcaster, panelist, blogger, and speaker. CSS is the bane of many web developers, except that one dude with the black turtleneck. We avoid working with them as much as possible. Aimee has written a very informative article on her blog about demystifying CSS and explaining what's going on under the hood. But before we get started, Will, what have you been fighting this week?
I'm just kind of back to work. We've hit the ground running. We've got a bunch of new clients. Upper management was kind of all gone the last week and a half, and a lot of people seem to come to me when that happens for whatever reason. So I've just been heads down coding and running around, fighting fires pretty much for the last little bit. So I'm not really fighting a lot other than that. How about you, Aimee?
I will say the weather. Like we were talking about before we got started, I live on a huge hill, and so whenever it snows, I'm kind of trapped. So Friday night when it snowed, I had all these intentions of finishing up work and going to the gym, and that didn't happen. I did finally get out on Saturday afternoon, and now I'm preparing again for more snow and potentially getting trapped. So I've parked my car in a different location in hopes that I will be able to get out at some point tomorrow. So maybe that's what I've been battling last week and a little bit this week.
I understand that. I had to come over and pick up Will. We do our developer launch pad on the second Saturday of the month, and he's got a big hill on his driveway and a hill getting into the neighborhood. And so I just drove over and picked him up at the entrance to the neighborhood so that he could actually come out with us this past Saturday.
But I also, it's gorgeous up here, so I love it, except when it snows.
Yeah, I understand that. Well, I've been letting it linger all afternoon. So sad about Dolores O'Riordan. I was a big Cranberries fan back in school, high school, college days. So just sort of listening to a lot of Cranberries this afternoon.
Oh man, I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, I found out, I think when I was at lunch, I saw it on Facebook. So over the holidays, I updated one of our services at work. I got it all working, passed all my unit tests. I even built in backward compatibility so that we didn't have to break all the apps that were using it. And for a couple of weeks, it's been working great, but only using the backward compatibility. So I started updating one of the apps to use the new endpoints and ended up spending about a day bouncing back and forth between the app and the service to get it working, because while it worked with all of the unit tests and sending things in through Postman, was coming in from an app, it just was not working right. So that was my week last week.
Yeah, no unit test survives first contact with reality.
That is so true.
That's funny. I like that.
After this week, though, I will be a certified Scrum developer / agile engineer. It's actually a bit of a lengthy process. You have to take multiple classes and work in a Scrum environment for over a year. And I'm finally taking the last class at the end of this week. Since we're talking about CSS, I've got something to educate you on how to use it for IoTs. This week for IoTs, I have an educational slideshow titled The CSS of the Internet of Things. This educational slideshow focuses on how to write CSS for devices by creating device-agnostic CSS styling. Luis Rodriguez, a UX designer and UI developer, looks at how to style your user interfaces using CSS and HTML5 on smart devices such as interactive TVs. He discusses the problems with embedded CSS and then gets into the details of building elements and styling them using the interactive TV as the example. It's a really cool slideshow to go through, especially if you like working with Internet of Things or smart devices. And I'll have a link to that in the show notes. Will, who's talking to us this week?
Well, we got an email from Kim. It says, "Dear Will and BJ, I've been listening to your podcast for over a year now, and it has really inspired me throughout my journey from my PhD in ecology to becoming a software developer/data scientist in finance. You guys have great advice and fantastic attitudes towards learning, but there's one thing I have difficulties agreeing with. I really think that the employer should give you training opportunities and make sure you stay up to date with the latest advancements in your field. Of course, the training should be relevant to your position, and the responsibility to find the right training should be mostly the employee's responsibility. It really should be in the employer's interest to make sure the employees develop too. So I would not think that a company that does not pay for some training is a good place to stay. Perhaps this is partly a difference in workplace culture. I'm in Sweden, but I think you would agree to at least some of these points. Thanks for all the inspiration and tips."
Will and Kim have been talking back and forth on email, but one thing that was said is that employers should offer training and should help you keep up with tech, but you don't want to be in a position of relying on them to do so.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of comes down to the stuff that we were talking about in the Build Your Own Story episode of not letting somebody else determine what your story is. You know, it's right. You want to direct your career. It's great if your employer is going to help you with that, but you still have to make it work, even if they're not. So you want to kind of decouple yourself from it.
I was going to say, I have an interesting thought on this, if I could chime in too really quick.
Yeah.
So one thing I've kind of discovered in my career, I haven't been doing this, terribly long. I've been doing this about 3 years as I changed careers. But I've found the best balance to be, I've worked in startup environments where you're working, a lot more hours than typical, a lot more on the clock for that specific employer, more than your 40 hours, and being on call and that kind of stuff. When you're constantly on call and doing that, it really drains you, I think, of your energy and your enthusiasm to want to keep up to date and learn more. So kind of my philosophy on it is as long as my employer has realistic expectations of what they'll get out of me day to day. And of course there's going to be deadlines from time to time where you have to work extra, but as long as it's not a reoccurring thing, that I have the energy at night and on the weekends to go learn on my own. I wish employers would give us the opportunity to study and stuff, but I'm not a little bit of training, maybe a conference or something once a year, but I'm not so sure. It's kind of a dream come true to be in a place where you get to do it every week or something like that.
Yeah.
So.
And that's kind of where I was going with it. I've worked, I've been in tech for, my whole career. And what I've seen is companies will train you on the stuff that they're doing right now.
Yeah.
And then they'll make a change in direction. And if you don't already have that skill set, you get cut.
Yeah.
And so you don't ever, it's more about managing your personal risk than it is about what the employer should or shouldn't do.
Yeah. That, I don't know. I feel as developers, coming from this not always being my career, we're very fortunate. And it's important to remember that, I think.
Yeah.
I feel very fortunate because where I work, we have a training program that will help you grow into your career.
That's awesome.
Yeah, they have different paths, and you can say, okay, I'm on the developer path, and then pick classes to take. We even have it as part of our performance plans that get reviewed to do so many trainings because they want us to stay up to date, and it's really nice. That said, I still have my own Pluralsight account and use other tools to help be in control of my own education because there's things that I want to learn that aren't going to be offered there or aren't really relevant to the job I'm doing now, but it's something I would like to have that skill set.
Yeah,
And
totally.
so-
Like I love when employers offer like Pluralsight or even just like a book club between the developers or lunch and learn, like things like that I think are very attainable.
Yeah, I've actually gotten it cleared with management where I work for me to put on some lunch and learns for my team. So
That's awesome.
we've got to
awesome.
do that, and it gets me. It's helping me learn too, right? Because that gets me presentation skills and all that. Because I'm kind of aiming for a slightly different vector on the career a little bit, so it works out well. But I mean, yeah, I just wouldn't rely on an employer for that. And the other thing that also feels a little sketchy to me is like if you get a Pluralsight account from an employer. And then you get on there and let's say you're a C# developer and then you start looking at Node, are they gonna interpret that as this guy's about to jump ship? Like I always, and I'm probably a little bit more paranoid than I probably should be, because I was around for like the waves of outsourcing. And so I guess it's a little bit different perspective, and I'm not sure it's really that way now.
Interesting.
No.
Wow. Yeah.
Well, hey, Kim, thank you so much for the commentary and the great email. We got a lot out of this. Just the conversation here was really good. Send us another email with your contact information because we've got a Complete Developer water bottle just for you. And guys, if you'd like your very own Complete Developer water bottle, leave us a review in iTunes or comment on the website or any of our social media. We post all of our episodes to Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Google+. We're also on Path and Tumblr. And as of this past weekend, we finally posted our first thing on Instagram. It's a picture of me and Will with beer, but hey,
And absolutely no one is surprised.
But you guys can also check us out on Facebook and Twitter Live every Monday evening. We talk about what's going on in the tech world and answer a few listener questions, or join the conversation anytime via Slack by going to slack.completedevelopernetwork.com. Aimee Knight is a former figure skater turned software engineer. She's a graduate of Nashville Software School here in town, where she focused on JavaScript, Node.js, and Ruby on Rails. Outside of work, she's a panelist on the JavaScript Jabber and Angular Air podcasts, and an avid runner, lifter, and reader. As a type A personality, she's not at peace unless she has a set of challenges in front of her. And Will and I both understand that.
Yeah. So I got to ask, since that came up, did you get a break at Christmas? Did you get time off?
From work, yes.
Yeah, I did too. How long did you make it when you were off work before you actually wrote a line of code?
Oh, not long at all. I don't think I can go a day without opening my computer. I did on occasion. I will, like if I'm around family or something like that, just to give them my undivided attention. But yeah, it doesn't go very long. I made it 41
hours.
Yeah, that's a good long time. I'm not sure I could go that long.
Well, I was sick for it.
He told us that he was going to take what was it, like 2 weeks off, and I said you won't make it 4 days.
2 weeks. Wow, I give you credit.
Yeah.
So our theme for this year is build your story. And Aimee, you've built a really fascinating story. I first heard about it when you were on the Code Newbie podcast.
Oh man, so long ago.
And there's a question that I like to ask all of our guests before we really get into the episode. That is, what caused you to first become interested in software development?
Oh yeah, so I'll try to answer this like in kind of 60 seconds. If it can be 60 seconds spent, as you said, full life pretty much as competitive figure skater. In college, I kind of focused on like marketing, and that's what I ended up doing after college. So it was in that role that I was working alongside developers, and I was like marketing / project management. Like I worked in a small advertising agency. So we kind of wore a lot of hats, and it was probably like a good year and a half, 2 years where they had an expression engine site. The company had changed offices, and I kept asking the developers, like, can you guys just go in and update the address? And as a project manager, like, we still had like, our own stand-ups every morning, and I just got tired of asking. And so like one weekend, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to figure this out myself. So I did, and like I was hooked. I didn't want to leave the house, which I'm learning. Well, I've learned like in the past year and a half or so that we definitely need to be more well-rounded and stuff like that. But like I just was so hooked at first that I would like come up with excuses of like why I wouldn't want to like go shopping with my girlfriends or something. So yeah, I was hooked, and you're making changes on the live site, so I was just like tweaking CSS here and there just to like watch it change and then revert it back before anybody can tell in the morning. This is like a small like site and nobody's looking at it. So, but the developers, I was kind of friends with them, so I kind of like told them how I was really interested in it, and they just encouraged me to go from there, and the rest is history.
Nice.
I think that's really awesome. I love hearing how people get into it, and I really like that you were around a good group of developers that encouraged you to pursue it. Because you hear so much about the stereotype of developers being elitist and things like that, and it's not really the case that much anymore.
No, he was great. I still am in touch with so many people that I knew when I first got started, and it's awesome.
So a lot of web developers avoid CSS or cascading style sheets as much as possible. And the lucky ones, like me, get to have standards that once they're set, they no longer have to worry about them, or they're someone else's problem. Some developers even have trouble understanding the difference between an ID and a class and how to appropriately use them.
Oh, yeah, I've seen their check-ins.
I got that line from one of your stories.
Oh, man. Like putting it, like giving 100 instances on a page the same ID.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. It's like I can feel like my scalp heating up from being irritated by that. Just thinking about it. Ugh. Yeah, that was a mess.
So Aimee has come on to the show to answer some of our questions about what's actually happening when we apply CSS to our websites. First, we're going to talk about how the browser understands and interprets the CSS that we write. Then we'll discuss some of the common mistakes that developers make when working with CSS. So to get us started, how does the browser know what to do with the style sheets and where to apply them?
Totally. And I guess I'll probably go through, like my Medium post a little bit. I've also given a talk on this, and I can probably, I don't know if you guys do like show notes, but I can provide links to all that when we finish up. But, the first thing that the browser does is, it goes and fetches your HTML. That's before it does anything. It's got to do that. So it goes and fetches that either off of like your disk or network, probably if you're it's a regular website. But so the browser starts, reading your HTML page. And if you have a style sheet in there, it's going to encounter that link tag. And at that point, before it does anything, it goes and fetches the style sheet. And that's when it starts what you would like say, quote unquote, is the parsing process. Like the parsing process for HTML and CSS, although different in a lot of ways, it's still very similar in a lot of ways. So I guess to back up too really quick, I kind of dug into this because, I don't have a traditional computer science background. So a lot of this stuff was like more low level than what they got into, in the boot camp. We maybe spent like a day or something on stuff like this. So I'll throw around some words and I'll try to explain those if you have newer developers who are not familiar with these words. So really, if you want to break it into like chunks, this process. So once it gets that style sheet, it's going to go through something called conversion, tokenization, and then lexing or parsing, which are kind of the same thing. So conversion, the browser, when it receives your style sheet, it's literally just like raw bytes. It doesn't look like CSS as we write it. So once it does that, then it goes through the tokenization phase. So some people who are listening probably have heard of an AST in JavaScript, which is an abstract syntax tree. And tell me if I'm going too fast or I need to slow down or anything.
No, this is great.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, good.
So, just an FYI, I know Will said that he has a CS degree. I do not. My degree is in psychology, and I'm completely self-taught.
Awesome.
So I found, I read through your blog blog post and was just like, I read it 2 or 3 times because I'm like, this is really good.
That makes me feel good. I love digging deep. I love like reading and digging deep. I'm one of those developers who just like can't go deep enough. Anyway, so picking up where we left off. So then we go through that tokenization phase, which is once you go through the conversion process and you go through tokenization. So you already have like your style sheet has been converted to something that looks a little more like CSS, but it has to break that up. So it's going to break up like an opening curly brace. It's going to break up that kind of stuff, like your selectors. So it doesn't look like I have. It's hard to do this without my slides. So I have a visual in my slides that like you can imagine kind of like an array. If we're thinking about HTML, that array would have like a start tag, and then it would have an attribute name, then like your equal sign, then an end tag. So rather than it being like one long string with all of that, it's like an array of tons of strings that are just like these different tokens.
Yeah, it's kind of like a dictionary type setup where you can hit it, look up.
Yes. So once you have everything broken up into those valid tokens, then you go on to lexing and parsing. And this is where like the HTML and CSS, that process is going to be a little bit different, because what lexing and parsing is, it's identifying the type of each token based on what they call is like the expected grammar. So the browser knows whether or not it's reading an HTML sheet or a CSS style sheet. And so if it gets HTML and something that's supposed to be CSS, it's going to be like, I don't know what to do with this. I can't parse this because, this isn't like valid. Anyway, so that's what the lexing and parsing process is. It's knowing, you can think of that basically as like, understanding the English language. It's understanding, like, based on what I'm saying, I'm speaking English, and you're gonna know to interpret what I'm saying based on that.
Yeah, we used to use that, back in the day, because the parsers were widely different. I mean, this is like Netscape and IE days, and you could actually put invalid CSS in there.
Oh, I didn't know that. Really?
Yeah, wow. And so it would pick it up on one and not on the other, and so that's how you could do your browser sniffing.
I didn't know that. So
yeah, you don't want to go there again.
So that's another area too where it's very different. So HTML is CSS is, and like JavaScript are like conventional parsers, and I think I wrote down some notes. We'll probably get into this a little bit later. Whereas HTML is not a conventional parser. It's what they call is like not context free. So when you give the browser like ill-formed HTML, it's going to be smart enough to render that no matter what. So when it's going through and parsing that's what we mean by not context free, meaning it has to take for like the given object that it's on, or the given chunk that it's on. It has to know what comes before and what comes after it. Whereas with CSS, that's not the case.
Right, because CSS is declarative instead of imperative.
Yeah, it's like with CSS, it's like what you put in, you're always going to get the same thing out.
Okay. So
hopefully that answers that question.
Definitely covered it.
Yeah.
Well, how is this different from the way the browser understands JavaScript then?
So I think like the first thing that people maybe who haven't really dug into this, they don't always realize is that the CSS engine and the JavaScript engine are totally different. So CSS and HTML are parsed via the rendering engine, whereas JavaScript is like the JavaScript engine, so like V8 for Node or something like that. And when we ask like, how is it different? In a lot of ways, it's actually very similar. But I would say like the thing that I had noted here is like CSS and JavaScript are different because your JavaScript a lot of times is reaching for your CSS. And so they have to go separately. So CSS is blocking, which means that no JavaScript can be executed. And this is by default. You can change this if you want based on different like attributes you would give things. But by default, it's blocking because if you went ahead and executed all your JavaScript before the CSS was done, it could be possibly like very jarring for the user. And then, like I said, a lot of times like your JavaScript is going to be reaching for things based on your CSS. And so if the CSS isn't done, JavaScript can get wrong answers. So I'd say, it's not really different as far as parsing. Both CSS and JavaScript are context-free, like we were talking about. It's more like the HTML and CSS that are a little bit different, like we were talking about.
So from a debugging standpoint, you could have busted CSS that you may not realize until you're trying to do something with JavaScript.
Well, you could have, I would say, maybe the browser is rendering your CSS in a way that you're not expecting. And so potentially you would write your JavaScript in a way where you're trying to get at something that might not be there.
Yeah, or you're creating elements that have got CSS classes on them, and you don't see it until the JavaScript runs, so it's a runtime error. Yeah.
I could see that being a problem where you may be thinking it's a JavaScript error, and you go in and it's, oh, hey, this is how the CSS is working, not my JavaScript. So.
Yeah, my favorite is when you get somebody that uses jQuery to store page state in just controls, and they build everything with jQuery, like all the dynamic content on the page is built that way and put together that way. And you talk about just nasty to debug CSS problems. Yeah.
Well, I've been fortunate enough that I haven't had to do a lot of jQuery in my day. Or I've done jQuery, just not I've always had a front-end framework to be able to use, so I've been fortunate.
Yeah. jQuery was the bomb when it came out.
I still think it was pretty cool. That was the very first thing I learned as far as JavaScript, but building complex applications, I've been lucky to always be able to use a framework.
Yeah.
It's very nice. When I first started learning, Will was my mentor, and he made me use vanilla JavaScript on everything.
And CSS as well.
Yep. So I've heard about the CSS object model, and is it CSS OM? I don't know. What is that, and kind of how does it affect the rendering?
Yep. So, as we were talking about, maybe I'll back up too and try to visualize this for people listening. And like I said, hopefully they can go and maybe check out the blog post and check out my talk, because I have some really good visuals in there. But if we step back, so first, the browser starts parsing the HTML. Encounters that link tag, like we said, then it starts parsing the CSS. But ultimately, the browser has to create the document object model for your HTML, and then it also has to create the CSS object model, which are two completely different data structures to the browser. And so how do they affect each other? They don't affect each other at all. As those two independent data structures. But how they do affect each other is the browser then, once it's constructed the CSS object model and constructed the DOM, then it mashes those two together into something called the render tree. And that is how they affect each other, is once they are in that render tree, then the render tree is more of, you can think of the render tree as, it's kind of like the next step the browser has to go to before it can lay things out. Because if, we'll say you might have an H2 tag, and underneath that a paragraph tag, and then an H3 tag. Well, maybe your CSS is going to absolutely position like a div that has that H3 tag or something. It's going to absolutely position that somewhere. That's probably not great CSS or something, but just to kind of try to visualize this for people. So the render tree then has that information. So the render tree is a more accurate representation of what things are going to look like when they're laid out.
That makes sense. I mean, it's kind of that the render tree is a projection of the CSS object model and the HTML.
Yes.
So, I mean, what's the process the browser goes through when rendering a web page?
Yep. So, like I said, so the first thing, we kind of just went into that. So it's going to mash that DOM and CSS object model together into the render tree. Once it has the render tree, then it goes through layout, paint, and composite. So layout is, I think a lot of people sometimes don't necessarily always think through the different properties, just because, we're developers and we like to program and not always do markup languages like CSS. But layout has to do with any properties that affect like positioning, size. It's going to include calculating how much space an element's going to take up. And then the other thing in the layout phase is that it's important to keep in mind that the parent elements can affect their children, and then sometimes children elements will affect the parent. Right. For instance, when the browser is going through the layout process, it's going to calculate the width of that particular node, but then the height is calculated based on the children. And so I think a lot of people, as you're debugging and thinking through things, it's important to keep that kind of stuff in mind. So then once we go through the layout process, then the browser does a paint. So anytime that you trigger a layout, the browser is always going to have to trigger a paint. So when possible, you always want to just use properties that trigger a paint event, so you don't have to go through the whole layout process. Anyways, but painting is really just the process of converting those nodes in the render tree into the actual pixels on the screen, because now that we have the size, we can actually quote unquote paint them. So that would be anything like colors and images, borders, shadows, stuff like that. And then we go on to composite. And so for painting, you want to think that painting process is kind of done usually in multiple layers with compositing. And we'll go through multiple rounds of painting, because if you think of with CSS, you have the cascade, and it's kind of like a recursive process as it goes down with the cascade and specificity. But then you go into composite, and I think we'll probably get a little bit deeper into compositing, but just at a base level, it's kind of like Photoshop layers. It's just the action of flattening those painted parts and then putting all those chunks of painted parts together.
Yeah, I mean, we deal with the same thing because I deal with printing software, and we have to kind of do the same thing where we calculate the layout first, and then we render pieces of it and then composite those over. It's the same kind of structure. Yep. It's just basic graphics programming. Yep. Fun and games.
See, I was thinking in terms of audio editing, because I edit all of our episodes and master them. And I was thinking this sounds a lot like what I do in that process, where I'll edit the episode and I'll take what we say during the episode and I'll add it to a layer of our opening and closing, and then I'll add the layer of the music. Then, set it so that the talking overpowers the music, and all this other stuff in there. But that's exactly what I was thinking when you were going over. Yeah,
you're kind of doing. I guess it's it's the audio version of the visual, pretty much. Yeah, right. That I see that.
I feel like I need to come up with a skating or workout analogy now, but but maybe that'll come to me later.
Well, see, you do your CrossFit, and then you got your protein shake, and then you
compositing those things together to
and then you composite that with I got to be at the gym in 23 minutes, and then you're set, right? You got the whole, that's your layout and your render tree right there.
I take my pre-workout and it starts flowing through my veins, and I use the pre-workout, and all that goes together for me to do a lift. I don't know.
Yeah.
Will mentioned CrossFit, and my first thought was, if you have a vegan CrossFitter, which they tell you about first.
That's a great joke.
Well, it depends on the Z index of the. Actually, they're which frame is it?
Oh, that is a great joke. I love it.
Yeah. So, speaking of things that make me feel like a joke, how do you tell when a particular or where a particular CSS entry gets used? This is something I get burned by a lot, where, because it's declarative and elements are coming up, sometimes being dynamically rendered. Sometimes some goober has used string concatenation to come up with the CSS class that happens to be referenced in the file. How do you approach this stuff?
So the way that your styles get applied, it's all about specificity and that cascade. So really, basically what the browser does when it goes through all of this, the cascade has to take into account like the importance of the styles that are getting applied. So if you have like the important flag, which is such a code smell, don't use that. And then
it's all over mine right now. I'm aware of that.
That's definitely a code smell. And then it has to take into account like the origin, meaning if it's a user agent style versus like a style that we actually write, and then specificity, and then source order. So it takes all of those things, and that's what it uses to calculate the actual number that we'll give to a specific style. Because, we all like kind of think, CSS is like, oh, I hate it. And, it's like my talk, or my blog post, it's magic, but it's not. Like, it's just, the browser is following, code, just like any code that we write. It has to have like a systematic way of doing this, which is like why I wanted to dig into this stuff, is because I felt like I was just kind of like blindly throwing darts at a dartboard. And I as I got better and better as a developer, I could like systematically debug my JavaScript. And I always felt like if there was a bug in my JavaScript, I could figure it out. Given enough time, I could like systematically figure out what was happening. But with my CSS, I didn't feel the same way. And so I'm kind of going off on a tangent here. We'll get into this more later, but that's why all this stuff was important to me. So anyways,
I completely understand that, because the first project, like full on my responsibility project I had when training under Will, was our podcast website. And I wrote all the custom CSS for that, and I felt the exact same way. Like when I read in your blog post the throwing darts at a dartboard and hoping it hits something, I'm like, yes, that is exactly how I felt.
It was so frustrating to me because I didn't like feeling like I was just guessing. As programmers, we don't like to do that. Anyway, so people can go and check out my blog post for more specifics on this. But so the browser just has to like assign a weight to each rule, or it assigns a number to each rule. So because when there's multiple, a lot of times we have like multiple rules that are being applied to a certain element. So the browser just needs a way to like negotiate that. So just at a high level, if you broke this up into like 4 different columns, the first one would be like if you have an inline style, that's going to give you the most points. And then in the second column, then you're going to count up the number of ID selectors. And then the third column is the number of class selectors, attribute selectors, and pseudo classes. And then your fourth column is going to be the number of type selectors and pseudo elements. So it's hard to kind of talk about this on a podcast. Definitely go and check out the blog post. But I find if you are trying to figure out why a specific rule is not getting applied to your CSS, the first thing to do would be to like go into your developer tools and apply it to the element, because that's going to give you a higher specificity. So you'll be able to tell like, is the style you're actually writing like valid, and is it going to work? Or is it just not showing up because of a specificity problem? That's why I like using the developer tools for stuff like that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I use them all the time. I just about have to. Otherwise, I can't figure out where something's used. The thing that burns me more than anything, though, is when I have a chunk of CSS and I'm like, can I get rid of this?
Yeah.
Because we had some people that were really verbose and they tended to copy and paste. And so I'm cleaning up a code base that's got a lot of that in it. I mean, it all works, but you change something and you get rid of a chunk of CSS, and then that removal doesn't do anything because there's some further down that they used. And so I haven't found a real good way to reverse engineer and go, is this used in this project?
Yeah,
that's what I was about to ask. Is there a tool out there that can go, is this being used
anywhere? There are a
anymore?
lot of tools out there. I have not dug a ton into that because it hasn't been a challenge that I've faced as of yet. I have a feeling that I know that will change at some point in my career. It may change sooner rather than later. But yeah, there are tools out there that do that.
So, Will, that might be something that you could look into, is a tool to say, is this chunk of CSS being used?
Yeah, because that's the biggest pain point for me, because when you have software that's been around for a while, especially from, when it's 10, 12 years old or more, the old CSS is still there and everybody's afraid to touch it because they don't know what's, where it's actually used. And, some of your tools will help you a little bit on that, but like it's really hard, especially if it's dynamic in JavaScript, to even figure out where it's used. The only thing I've found is like Control Shift F in Visual Studio and just look for that chunk, that part of that CSS class name or whatever, and hope that you can find a usage and tell that it's being used.
Right. So something that I've been wondering about, and you hear the term hardware acceleration with browsers. How does that hardware acceleration affect the loading of a page?
Yeah. So back to compositing. So I included this because one thing that I didn't always, understand. I heard everybody saying about talking about hardware acceleration. And it was kind of a buzzword to me. I didn't really understand what they meant. But when we say hardware acceleration, what we're referring to is that compositing phase that we talked about earlier. Before the browser was written in it didn't have compositing, so it would always have to use the CPU. But with compositing, you use a GPU, and there are certain properties that are actually going to trigger composite versus a paint layout, something like that. So there are certain properties like transform or opacity. If you want to hide something and you want to do that with compositing or with hardware acceleration, you might change the opacity of an element and try that, because that's going to be more performant since you only have to go through the compositing phase. You don't have to do a paint phase. So that's where hardware acceleration comes in. And one thing that I was guilty of, and I see so often, is as developers, myself included, a lot of times we're quick to reach for JavaScript to solve a problem, when actually if our CSS skills, whenever I say we, because I was guilty of this, I knew, if my CSS skills were better as they are now, I can tell, when is CSS the right tool to solve a problem, and when is JavaScript the right tool to solve a problem, because JavaScript is not always the right tool, because JavaScript is going to, use their CPU instead of the GPU. So CSS, we don't want to shy away from CSS, because CSS is there for a reason. And it's there to help us.
That's the quote of the episode. I like that. I like that a lot. And it leads right into the next sort of set of questions, which are about where developers get into trouble. Where do you see, other than inappropriately using JavaScript where they shouldn't, where do you see developers having trouble understanding how CSS works?
So for me, for this, when I first started digging more and more into CSS, the thing for me was that, like I said, I didn't always know when to reach for JavaScript, when to use CSS, but, and like we also talked about, I also felt like I wasn't able to debug my CSS like I was my JavaScript. But the mindset for writing CSS is very different than it is for writing JavaScript. So in JavaScript, having a global variable is not typically a good thing, unless you actually need a global variable for a specific reason. But you want things encapsulated in your JavaScript, and you want things to be pure and not bleed all over the place, typically. but with CSS, that's the point of CSS. You want that cascade. Imagine I think component-based styling is really good in a lot of aspects, because you easily get around that specificity problem and you win that war very easily, but there's always trade-offs. And so if you do component-based styling and you gain that specificity, you lose the cascade, and that's cascading style sheets. Like, that's a core component to CSS. So it requires a different mindset. Like, you have to be okay with, because it makes sense with CSS. Like, if I have a color and I have to go into every single component and update that color if they want to tweak it, versus like I have like a variable in my CSS that's just global, and I allow all my other styles to or all my other rules to inherit from that global variable, and I only have to update that color in one place, and that's a good thing. So yeah, it's just a very different way of thinking, and also I think a lot of developers, because CSS, like HTML, is a markup language, is not a programming language. I think a lot of people think maybe it's like wussy or something like that. Myself included. Like, I'm guilty of all these things.
I understand. I remember, I'm aging myself here. I remember in high school, I was taking programming classes like C++, and my friends were talking about, oh yeah, I do programming too. I did this on my MySpace page with HTML, and thinking HTML is not a real language, and having that, I guess, arrogance about it. But then I got into, when I came full circle back to development, I got into web development and end up writing a lot of HTML, mostly components, but I still end up writing a lot of it. And I really liked what you said about that being, that CSS requires a different mindset, because that makes sense. It's not going to be the same as JavaScript. And I agree with you. I think that is probably going to be the area that most developers suffer or have the most difficulty, is that they are trying to apply the rules of the JavaScript world to the CSS world or something like that. My lead front-end developer, who was on a team with me when I first started, he even told me one time, he's like, yeah, I can tell when in your code you switch from C# to JavaScript, because you'll write JavaScript like C# for about 30 minutes to an hour, and then you'll start writing JavaScript.
That's funny.
Yeah, I have that same issue. I think the other thing that burns developers is the way that CSS tends to build things as kind of a composition model, not like an inheritance structure like you would have more in JavaScript or even in C#. It's you've got, instead of having a tree of things that you're looking at, it's like there's pieces in all these other places, and you figure out which ones go.
Yeah, and CSS is like other languages, though, in that there's a lot of different ways to do the same thing. What types of considerations do you think developers need to take when choosing how to style their pages?
Yeah, totally. So one thing here that was really interesting to me that I discovered as I was kind of digging into this. So this kind of piggybacks on what we were just talking about. It's important too to not dismiss the CSS and to keep up to date on your CSS skills. Like, now we have CSS Grid. Flexbox has been out there for a while now. But I was reading somebody actually did a performance test on a Flexbox layout versus a floated layout. They took their floated layout and converted it to Flexbox, and the floated layout took 14 milliseconds to render, and the Flexbox layout took 3.5 milliseconds to render. So I think developers need to keep in mind they have to keep up to date on their CSS skills, just like they're doing on their JavaScript skills. People are really excited about JavaScript, and they don't always get super excited about CSS. But as you can see there, especially too with CSS being render blocking, you want it to be as performant as possible.
I would agree with that. I mean, I think a lot of it too is just the knowing how all these pieces fit together and where stuff happens, like what the video card does, especially with graphics acceleration and all that, all that jazz.
Yeah.
Cutting down the number of repaints and all that. It's very interesting to figure out how to structure CSS.
Yeah, exactly. Like I was saying, you would want to use opacity to potentially hide something. versus like display none or something like that, because like a display none is going to have to go through more rounds versus like just using composite.
Yeah, I mean, we deal with this, just like in Windows desktop programming. You have you have messages that come in from the OS that say I've got to repaint this part of the screen, and so like if you're resizing a window, you don't necessarily you don't want it repainting on every part of the mouse drag, and so you'll paint the whole thing and have that in a buffer, and then you just show it versus an actual redraw, and so you kind of have to optimize the same way if you're trying to get the CSS performance, which is it's still hard for me to do it. I'll be honest.
I can see that being a big issue. Again, I'm lucky I don't have to do a lot of that kind of CSS performance type stuff because we have standards where I work that have been set by designers and people with expertise like you in CSS. So I just get to go build things, which from my perspective is nice, but I love this this deep dive, and something I didn't say this earlier, but Will and I have a term for it because before getting into programming, I was a med student going through medical school, and when I would go on a deep dive into something and just like really go full depth into learning something, Will called it going full med student.
I love it. That would totally be me. Yep.
Yeah. And so it sounds like, from your description, I was like, she totally went full med student on this.
Yeah.
So with all of that, there's a lot around using tags with CSS. What are some of the common mistakes that developers make when trying to specify a tag using CSS?
Yeah, so we kind of talked about it a little bit earlier, but not understanding how that specificity is calculated. And two, I say you can go through and add up these values. It's not a base 10 system, so you have to be aware of that. But you can still go through and calculate things kind of like that. So I would say just that. A lot of people get tripped up. And I think, I have a quiz I give during the talk, and usually people, a lot of people don't usually know the right answer. So that just tells you, and I know for me too, a year and a half ago, I wouldn't have known the answer either.
If it's the same one on your blog post, I got the wrong answer with the first time I went through it.
Yep. So I would say just that, making sure, you probably don't want to make something overly specific too if you don't have to, because the browser is going to have to do more calculations there. So, you don't slap on a bunch of IDs and classes just for the sake of it. Use the cascade.
Right, because it's not really quite a dictionary. It's not got a constant lookup time to figure out where something is.
Yeah, because it has to recursively go through this over and over and over again.
So what are some of the things that developers do wrong when positioning elements within CSS?
So as far as positioning goes, I would say I don't know if I see a lot of people doing stuff wrong with positioning. The only thing that came as a surprise to me, which I kind of mentioned a little bit as we were talking about earlier, is how height and width are determined. So width being computed based on the current node styles, and then height being computed based on the children. And then too, as far as what other things that our developers doing wrong, again, not keeping up to date on their CSS skills, so that they're still using a floated layout to position things where they could be using Flexbox or something like that. So I would say those are the common things that I see. Yeah.
Along that same vein, we mentioned Z-index before. Are there any areas that developers get into trouble when they're stacking their elements using the Z-index?
Oh, yeah. So in my blog post and in my talk, I have a completely separate section devoted to Z-index. And specificity and z-index were the biggest. I did like a Twitter poll to get thoughts on what was tripping people up the most. So those were the two I dug into, but I had no idea. Like I said, I failed my own quiz. I didn't know. But same thing for z-index. When people are trying to debug z-index, I don't think a lot of people know that z-index is all about something called a stacking context. And what a stacking context is like you want to be able to look up your DOM structure and know where your stacking context begins. Because if you're trying to apply a z-index to something in a different stacking context, it's not going to be able to move backwards or forwards. It's all based on that current stacking context. So, and again, something has to have a position property in order for that z-index to work. Sorry.
So that's kind of the same sort of problem you have. Like if you're trying to absolutely position something because you actually need to do that, and you don't have its parent element where it's relatively positioned. You get weird stuff with that. Because I had to kind of do a WYSIWYG editor for documents. And so like fake a page and have an area that they can edit and, all that kind of stuff. And I fought with that for hours and hours before I finally figured out, I don't have the parent context is not set where the child knows how to render itself. And so it was doing it absolute relative to the next thing up that actually had a relative positioning on it. That was awful trying to figure that one out.
Yeah, and then I will say this, probably the most frustrating bug that I've seen a lot of senior UI engineers hitting this and not knowing is that there are different properties besides the index that create new stacking contexts. So like opacity, different transforms that you apply to elements. Those all create new stacking contexts. So it's important to be able to know that, because you could be creating a stacking context with a certain property and rule that you're applying and not even know it.
I didn't realize that about opacity. I guess it kind of makes sense, though, because they have to use that for the compositing to figure out where stuff is. So maybe there's like a fake element there, like a virtual thing for actually setting that or something. I don't know how they would do it inside the rendering engine, but it would kind of make sense that would change it.
Yeah, I haven't dug that deep, but yeah, potentially. There's so the rabbit hole just goes forever.
Yeah,
I can see that. So finally, we've talked about a few things within CSS, but how do you feel about CSS frameworks like Bootstrap? Do you feel like these are a crutch or a boon for developers?
So this is something my mentor kind of ingrained in my head, and it comes up time and time again. I think as developers, a lot of times we want black and white answers, use a framework, don't use a framework. But I think it all really depends on what you're trying to do. There are always trade-offs. And so to answer this question, I think using Bootstrap or Foundation, I think they're really good in a lot of cases, because if you need to do something quickly, they're going to, normalize cross-browser differences easily and stuff like that. But if you have I've been working at Warner Brothers for coming up on 2 years, and at Warner Brothers, their brand is everything, and so you can't really, you could use maybe a grid or something from those frameworks, but you really need to be strong enough to be able to do all of this yourself, and you don't want to have a lot of bloat in there, pull in Bootstrap and then you're just overriding a lot of things. I find a lot of developers doing that, where they're pull in Bootstrap or Foundation and then end up just having to apply really importance all over the place to override things, when maybe if you have the time, you don't want to have to do that. You would want to do it from scratch then.
I've seen the same thing as well. And I would agree with that on the Bootstrap. The other thing that I like about doing that, though, is that I can lay something out and get it going, and then I can have a design person actually move the bits around, and it doesn't intersect badly with my code if I'm careful. Whereas I've noticed if I hand roll the CSS, I seem to find that I get burned more by the designer moving stuff around.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's just a lack of capability on my part or if that's a thing or not, but it definitely seems to. I think there's a place for Bootstrap and frameworks. It's just,
yes,
I wouldn't put it on a front-facing client site. Probably, like if you're doing something internal, the company could have its own Bootstrap CSS theme, and they just say, "Hey, everybody's using this. Build our CRUD apps." But like with Warner Brothers, you're going to have Bugs Bunny popping up on screen somewhere. Like how do you? There's not a Bootstrap primitive for positioning Bugs Bunny. I don't think they've bloated it that far, at least. So you kind of have to.
Now I got to look this up.
Yeah.
So the other thing too that I think will be interesting there to see what happens is they have something coming out called Houdini, which is this task force from different browser vendors, different people that work on those different browsers that are coming together. And they're creating this API to kind of hook into the CSS rendering engine. So like now with our JavaScript, a lot of times, we can hook in like Babel and we can do so much stuff, but we don't have that power in our CSS. And so it'll be interesting to me to see, I feel like we'll have less and less need for those frameworks. And then we could just incorporate like different build tools from, different things based on Houdini to normalize things and stuff like that.
Yeah, like tree shaking would be really nice. Kind of like they do with Angular. Yeah, ooh, that would save me a lot of pain at work, because then I could just leave the junk in there.
Yep, all those unused styles.
Yeah.
That makes sense. CSS is complicated and at times confusing, but it doesn't have to be something to avoid. While we don't have to know all the details of how our car works to drive it, knowing a little bit about what goes on under the hood can help when unexpected things happen. The same goes with development, and especially things that affect the look of your website. We want to thank Aimee for taking the time to come on the show and explain a few of these concepts to us. Will and I have a much better understanding of what's going on under the hood of the browsers now. Aimee, thanks a lot. How can people find out more about your talk and get in touch with you?
Definitely. Well, first off, thank you for having me. It was fun to hang out with you guys. As far as getting in touch, usually Twitter, my name there, or my Twitter handle is Aimee, _Knight with a K. From there, you should be able to find my website. And from there, my blog. And from there, you should also be able to find a link to my talk. So
awesome. And I'll have links to that in the show notes. Thank you so much for coming on. Also, since you are here in the Nashville area, we want to extend an invite to come out to any of our developer launchpad meetups at any time. So,
me too.
Yeah.
That pretty much wraps us up. Before we close everything out, Will, what do you have for us this week for Tricks of the Trade?
Well, I want to share a hack that I used for learning what I've learned about CSS, and because I started way back. Like the first web page I did literally was for NCSA Mosaic. So that's been a long time ago. We won't talk about how long ago that was. But I've got a pretty good trick when you run into something that is frustrating like CSS, especially when you're around other developers that maybe are not comfortable trying to help you because they don't know either. And that's the way you do your Google searches. Instead of going, okay, I'm going to try to come up with the right keywords for this thing. So how does the CSS box model work? Instead of searching for that, type in CSS positioning sucks. Because what you'll find is you'll get people, you'll end up on blogs where people have optimized for those keywords and are actually giving free content. And it's usually an on-ramp to something that you pay for. But if you go at it that way, you can get an answer quicker without having to try to formulate exactly, how it would match for a scholarly type article. And I do this all the time. In fact, I type CSS sucks, CSS whatever sucks quite a bit. And that's gotten me through a lot of really nasty situations. So I just want to throw that out there as something to do. Or, I hate CSS, whatever thing. And that's an easier way to query, because if you do that, again, you can leverage the fact that other people are trying to treat this as a marketing channel and get freebies from them and actually learn how to do things. So that's all I got.
Stand by for Titanfall.
If you have a question or comment, please email us at neckbeards@CompleteDeveloperPodcast.com. Our theme music is an excerpt from Stand By for Titanfall by Pure Bells, available on SoundCloud and licensed through Creative Commons. The intro music for IoTs is Hillbilly Hip Hop by Jason Belcher. For references, show notes, and to sign up for weekly emails with extra tips and insights, be sure to check out the website at CompleteDeveloperPodcast.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at CompleteDevPod and like our page on Facebook to keep up with news about the show. Look for us each week on Facebook Live before we record each episode. Thanks for listening. See you next time.